Good afternoon, everybody. Mike Franc with FREOPP, Chief Research Officer and Chief Bottle Washer as well, among all the other positions we have here. What we want to do today is talk to three of our more prolific scholars about instances where their research and their work has had some measurable, palpable results, and just to delve into that a bit and what might explain what are the attributes, what are the variables that need to be done right and in place in order for some of these successes to take place. And those can be a whole range of types of variables, everything from finding the right sponsor for a bill to being able to get the right data at the right time. So what I thought I would do just simply is start with Preston. And Preston, who's our higher education expert, has a great story to tell, and we can pull out from it anything that is kind of like universal that might be helpful for this audience. So Preston. And by the way, could everyone join me in a round of applause for Preston, as he just had he's a newly minted PhD in economics.
Thanks very much, Mike. So I want to take us back maybe 7 or 8 years to when I was just starting my career as a higher education policy analyst here in Washington, D.C. I was working with Jared. And the prevailing view among Republicans in Congress, on the Hill, even among the Republican kind of intellectual class was that, there wasn't really a problem with the student loan system because, if students are voluntarily, taking out loans, even if they're going to get a degree in, underwater basket weaving that's leaving them $200,000 in debt that they won't be able to, pay back, that's just their decision. What that kind of left out was the fact that it's not just their decision. They're going to the taxpayers to take on these loans, to take on this $200,000 of debt that they're probably not going to be able to pay back. That is going to go on the taxpayers. What's worse is that when the federal government says to students, here is a $200,000 loan to go get this degree, that is the federal government kind of implicitly putting a stamp of approval on that degree. They're saying that, you can take on $200,000 of debt for this, but that's fine because it's going to pay off, because we all know college always pays off, right? So anyways, it took some work to, change the conversation on that issue. Here at FREOPP, our research on the return on investment of higher education tries to calculate what is the actual financial value of all these tens and thousands of degree and certificate programs out there. We can say, a bachelor's degree in engineering will leave you better off by about $500,000 over the course of your lifetime, but a degree in art or music or psychology will probably leave you worse off than if you had not gone to college at all. And kind of putting this information on the table does eventually change the public policy conversation. And now I think Republicans, the conservative movement, are actually leaders. They're even leading more so than the Democrats on the fact that, the student loan system, the federal student loan system in the United States has propped up a lot of degrees which don't have a whole lot of economic value, that they are putting students into debt that they can't repay. They're becoming a major drain on the public purse. Taxpayers are losing hundreds of billions of dollars on these federal student loans. And just earlier this year, Senator Bill Cassidy, who's the ranking member of the Senate Education Committee, he introduced a bill that says, if you're a college and you want to get federal student loans, if you want to get taxpayer backing for your programs, you have to show us that if you're a bachelor's degree program, your students are earning at least as much as the typical high school graduate when they come out. And if you're a graduate degree program, your students have to be earning at least as much as the typical four-year college graduate. And just implementing that would take care of a lot of these programs that are leaving students worse off than they would have been otherwise. So I've just seen it, in my 7 or 8 year career here in DC in the higher education space, how just putting more information onto the table, and having these conversations can really change how the conservative movement is thinking about these issues.
And Preston, can you talk a little bit about what you've experienced in terms of the receptivity of people in the media to these ideas, and how that's maybe eased or helped the prospects for this concept?
Absolutely. So I think that a lot of what we've put out on the higher education front at FREOPP is actually pretty obvious to anyone with a brain. If college does pay off most of the time, but if tuition is too high, if you pick a field that doesn't have a whole lot of labor market relevance, or if you go to a school that doesn't have a great graduation rate, where a lot of people are dropping out and taking on debt but not having a degree, those kinds of programs are not necessarily going to pay off. And so what we find is, 72% of bachelor's degree programs out there do leave students better off financially, but there's a large minority, 28% of those programs, that tend to leave students worse off, and that's where our student loan programs are concentrated, in those 28% of programs. And so, just having this data out there, we actually put numbers to this, to what seems like fairly obvious. College pays off except when it doesn't. We're not putting anything like hugely new on the table, but we are giving people numbers to kind of think about this issue, and statistics that they can cite when they propose reforms to higher education, reforms to the student loan system to try and make it work better for students. It's still something that we all kind of know instinctively, but it's important, for us in the policy community to actually, put numbers on the table that people can grasp.
And relative to those numbers, maybe you could say a few words about the importance of how you actually handled and introduced the data into the discussion. What I'm getting at is what you're talking about automatically, which is the value of a particular degree over the lifetime of a person who received that degree from a particular institution based on the data. And maybe explain the difference between that kind of data point and what was going on before, where it was more of an average of the overall university.
That's right. So, if you go onto the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, and there's a page called, Earnings by Education. It's actually, the headline is Education Pays, which is not putting their thumb on the scales in one favor, one side or the other at all. But basically, they'll have a bunch of lines on a chart, and it says, here's your earnings if you're a high school graduate, and here's your earnings if you're a college graduate. And, the college graduate earns so much more than a high school graduate, so college must be great, and, that always makes you better off. Well, there's a bunch of asterisks we need to put onto that, that I mentioned before. If your college tuition is too expensive, sometimes the difference between those two lines isn't going to be enough to help you recoup the cost of tuition and the time you're spending out of the labor force. If you are going to a school with a high dropout rate, or if you're not academically prepared for college, you might be paying some of those tuition costs, but you're not getting the benefits of the degree. That's going to leave you worse off. And if you're studying a field that doesn't have a whole lot of labor market relevance, that pretty line that shows the average wages for college graduates, that might not necessarily be your scenario. Your line might actually be all the way down here, and in which case it might even be lower than the high school graduate line, and so that might not be making you better off either. And again, I think that this is something that a lot of us intuitively understand and have understood for a while, but it's important to actually put some numbers to it, and to show that those simplistic, just comparing average wages of college graduates to average wages of high school graduates misses a whole lot of nuance, and the fact that students aren't really necessarily being told that nuance all the time is hurting them in a lot of cases.
And let's turn for a second to Capitol Hill, and even at the federal level, the Department of Education. How has this set of ideas that you've turned into a wonderful overall reform effort been received over the last few years? Has it gotten easier? Is there resistance in certain pockets? What's your experience been on that?
Yeah, well, definitely when I would talk to offices, several years ago, there would be this sense of like, students are just, this is the free market at work. Students are just deciding to go to these programs, and that's their business if it doesn't pay off for them. And I think that view has shown itself to be a little bit naive, because it's not the free market at work. It's the federal government pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into colleges and universities, regardless of what their outcomes are. Making loans that a private bank would never in a million years think would be a good idea to make. And I think that that perspective on Capitol Hill has changed in the last few years. Certainly because of the kind of blow up that we've had with student loans, we've realized that a lot of people, are not necessarily able to repay the federal government for the loans that they've taken out. I think that there has been definitely a shift on Capitol Hill in terms of realizing that this is a big government program. This is not the free market at work, and if we're going to have this big government program, we do need to set some standards around what kind of loans are we giving out. What are going to be the expectations for colleges and universities that want to make use of these subsidies? And so I'm very excited about the fact that there seems to have been a shift in thinking on the Hill over the past 7 or 8 years of my career, and I'm excited to see where it goes from here.
Well, as one of my former colleagues at the Heritage Foundation used to say, that one of the things that you need to try to do is change the terms of the debate, and I think you've done that at a lot of different levels. And I guess we can go maybe now to Roger, who's our housing expert. And your world, as I've edited some of your papers, is very hard to decipher for a lot of people. Can you explain some of the big problems you've had in trying to advance some of your thinking, and maybe also, in a nutshell, your overall philosophy, which I love when you explain it in a succinct manner?
As opposed to the way I usually do. And I'm a philosophy major, by the way, so I'm breaking the curve. We don't need more affordable housing. We need more housing so that it's affordable. That's it.
That's it.
And that's a hard thing for policymakers to understand, because for years, and I mean for decades, with the advent of the low-income housing tax credit, what has happened is local intransigence on land use and housing has been rewarded with billions of dollars in tax credit financed subsidized housing. I've gone from looking at the low-income housing tax credit as being kind of not helping or not helping enough, to actually realizing that it is the source of what is called the housing crisis. Because going to what Preston was talking about, sort of irresponsible use of federal funds, what we've seen is that local governments will constrain the ability to produce more housing, and will do it without regard to data, with just sort of willy-nilly say, well, we're not going to allow you to have a pitched roof, or we're going to limit the envelope of a particular typology of housing, or we're going to eliminate a typology altogether, like microhousing. And then when demand surges in the market and prices go up, then it's a crisis. And so what do? You throw more money at it. And Republicans, Senator Young from Indiana is the one that I would call out, have supported this reckless use of the tax credit, and we're nowhere closer to resolving that issue today, I don't think. And I think we kind of have to break that system. And Senator Young's seatmate, Senator Braun, has actually introduced a request for information, which is a very small request to get better data from, because we don't know where all the billions of dollars we've spent on tax credit finance subsidized housing have gone. There's literally no record keeping about where did it all go. And this is, rather than being a scandal, is actually hand-waved by what I call the tax credit mafia, which is accountants, lawyers, people on Capitol Hill that just keep turning that tax credit crank, right? And until we can get to a place where we at least understand where all that money is going, and be able to kind of look at it in relationship to other options, it's going to be very difficult for us to move forward as a country to reduce the supply and demand imbalance when it comes to housing.
Yeah, in some of your recent writings, you've talked about just how lacking the data options are for all housing programs, but especially for the low-income housing tax credit. And as an outsider to this policy area, I was astonished at the kind of the almost criminality of there being tens of billions of dollars coming through that program every year, and we don't have any clue. If anyone wants to try to even assess success or failure, it seems like it's next to impossible. Could you just elaborate a little bit on how the situation is?
I mean, I was in a conversation and someone brought up to me and said, well, because I kind of go after what I call the nonprofit housing industrial complex. And they said, well, isn't it true that most of the tax credit programs are done by the private sector? And I thought, well, that's a good question. I should know that. And so I went in to try to understand, is there any source of data where I could look at that? And there's the only place that there is any data on nonprofit and for-profit division of where that tax credit gets used, was a giant spreadsheet. And if you've ever worked with the federal government, they love Excel spreadsheets that have about 985 columns and 1,000 rows. And when I went in and kind of looked at it, there was two numbers under something called, I think it was nonprofit, and there was a binary switch there, which was 1 was nonprofit and 2 is not nonprofit. And so, again, I'm a philosophy major, religious studies master's degree, so I kind of understand Excel, so I sort of did a sort. And first of all, it was like all these 1s and all these 2s, and then big blank spaces in the cells, right? So I'm like, just no data at all. And I looked into this, and yeah, sure, it was actually the 2s, the not nonprofit, were about 60% of where as far as the data went. I thought, well, gosh, these who are these for-profit companies making low-income housing? So I just drilled into a couple of these things and found that one of the not nonprofits was a project done by the Michigan Housing Authority, and it was just government, right? Well, it was not a nonprofit, it was government. Mm-hmm. So the garbage data that is collected on your tax dollars flushed out to these people is just not even collected. And so the Inspector General and also it was Inspector General went in and found that the other data that is collected by the IRS is kind of like going, we don't know where all this went. So they'll go in some filing cabinet and shuffle through a bunch of paper and say, well, we think this is where the money went. So it's an astonishing, wasteful, scandalous thing that, and this year alone, $13 billion will be allocated for that tax credit. And we just don't know, what it's paying for. And when you dig down into these individual projects, in Seattle, for instance, there is one project that was 47 units, something like 8. I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but it came down to $500,000 a unit. In California now, it's $1 million for an apartment. So just sit there and think about that for a minute, that your tax dollars are paying for a 600 square foot apartment for $1 million, mm-hmm. or anywhere from $500 to $1 million. And then they come back and say, we're in a crisis. We don't have enough money to solve this problem. And so I think it's emblematic of the problems we face with the federal government, that it's irresponsible, but the way that people's minds work is, well, we need more affordable housing, and that translates into more money, and that's.
Do you think the lack of the usable data that you just described almost serves a purpose of shielding the different players in this industry from any accountability? Is that part of what might be going on, that they don't want the data to be available? Because it seems like you're frozen in place until you can learn actually what's the case against this and how do you define it.
Yeah, and what's funny is the Senator Braun's bill basically is a request that HUD would have to put out to get responses from the community and from organizations. Tell us how you would want to report the data in a more transparent way. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's opposed by the tax credit mafia. They do not want that to pass, mm-hmm. because it would, if it got out into the world, then mm-hmm. we don't know where all these tax credits are going. People would start to ask the question, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't the right way to do this. So it's very disturbing, and I've kind of felt a little bit, like Lao Kuan on the beach when they're about to drag the Trojan horse into Troy, and saying, guys, we've got to stop doing this, and they just kind of go, can he shut up? and we've just been squashed again and again at the federal, state, and local level. But Senator Braun's bill, that proposal is the first little step towards can we get more information to share with the community? Yeah.
Dan Lips, you wear many hats, not just at FREOPP, but you have your father to how many kids?
Three.
3 kids, but you're also father to the education savings account concept. Can you explain a little bit about that, how that evolved, and what we can learn from it since then in the more recent round of victories in that area?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike. If you were here earlier today for Ovic's opening remarks, he talked about really the big picture challenge we face in advancing freedom and progress. And when we're looking for reasons for optimism, one of the areas of public policy where we can really see freedom and progress advancing has been in K-12 education. Just this past year, there have been 7 new bills creating new school choice programs, 10 existing education choice programs expanded, and altogether, as of 2023, 10 states are offering parents, universally offering parents the freedom to choose their children's schools or to use an education savings account to customize their children's education. We have some of the lawmakers who championed these programs in the room today. House Member Candice Perucci from Utah, Speaker Ben Toma from Arizona. You have delivered these historic victories for American children. When you count up what's happened through all these programs, as many as 20 million kids will now have benefit from choice programs in the coming years. This is historic victory, but when we look at when did this start, if you're only following this over the past few years, you might think, wow, this is a historic change that's come out of nowhere. But really, the education choice movement has been going on for decades. Some look back to Milton Friedman in 1955 in his seminal paper. Some look back to the 19th century with John Stuart Mill proposing these ideas long, long ago. Others to Milwaukee establishing the first voucher program in 1989. I look to 1998, which is when 2 philanthropists announced the formation of the Children's Scholarship Fund, Ted Forsman and the late John Walton. 2 heroes in my book basically stepped up and said, American children need to have choice in education, so we will, out of our own pockets, fund private scholarships for these children. They raised, along with their allies in the philanthropic community, $200 million, enough to fund 40,000 scholarships. And when they made those scholarships available to the nation's poorest families, they had enough for 40,000. More than 1 million kids applied. And to do so, to apply, they had to spend, their parents had to commit to spending about $1,000 out of pocket on their partial tuition payment. So here you have the nation's poorest families in the country saying, we're going to spend $1 billion to get our kids out of failing schools and into better opportunities. And when Forsman and Walton were announcing the Children's Scholarship Fund, they described that not only were they looking to help these specific children, they were looking to build a movement. They described it as the 4th wave of earlier social movements based on classical liberalism, pointing back to the labor movement, the suffrage movement, and of course the civil rights movement. This new movement was to be building around expanding education opportunity. That effort attracted many people, philanthropists. We'll hear later from Secretary DeVos, who invested much of her career and wealth in expanding choice. Political leaders like Governor Ducey, who we'll hear from tonight, who stepped up and had a vision for expanding choice. The state lawmakers who I've mentioned. Grassroots leaders. One of my heroes, I'm proud to call her a friend, is Virginia Walden Ford, who mobilized parents pushing to get their children a better future. And that movement really was built over 25 years. It also included the wonks like us, the think tank people. I was leaving college in 2000 and was excited by what I'd heard from the Children's Scholarship Fund, so went to work in a Washington think tank on education policy. And over the years, I got to work at a place like the Heritage Foundation out in Arizona. And my contribution to this movement was coming up with the idea of using education savings accounts, which existed in federal law as a way to save for your children's education, but to actually have the government provide funding directly into an account that families could use to either purchase tuition or to pay for homeschooling or to hire a tutor. really to take direct control of their child's share of public education funding. This was back in 2005 that I floated this concept in a paper. I left Arizona around that time. Others picked up that idea. My good friend Matt Ladner and others in Arizona developed it. Ultimately, working with state lawmakers, they enacted the first ESA program in Arizona. As we've seen through the process of the school choice victories that have happened over the years, other states have followed suit, Florida among them. So there was slow and steady progress over this 25-year period. Fast forward to 2020. The pandemic comes. Schools shut down. In many places, they shut down, like here in DC, for more than a year. So now it was not only the poor families that the Children's Scholarship Fund that we're hoping to help that realized they needed a choice. Each of the 60 million families in the country with K-12 students realized they needed a choice. I think that was the turning point for many of the victories we've seen over the past 2 years. But I don't think those victories would have happened had it not been for that movement that was built over the last quarter century.
So it was the right idea at the right time finally happened 13 years or so, or 15 years after you wrote that.
8, yeah,
Yeah.
depending on how you look at it.
Was there any, what I remember about some of the school choice battles when you were publishing that paper and even before, is that there was a fear of being too ambitious and saying we wanted universal, and it was always focused on different income level groups or different categories of students, like maybe military kids or foster kids, like I think you've worked pioneering work on that. What happened there that it allowed universal to suddenly be politically, was it the Overton window, right?
Yeah,
It was within it.
It's a great question, and I think that I was among the people who was back in 20 years ago, was advocating for incremental programs, believing that we could build a political consensus around helping those who needed help the most, and whether it was children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, foster children who face really huge challenge in their lives, children with special needs. And there were some incremental programs established around the country, but over time, the education reform groups that were really on the ground working with the state lawmakers and their staff and the governors realized that if these targeted programs weren't capturing the full picture, that really the best way to build these programs is to make them broadly available. In Arizona, where one of the first universal programs, fully universal program was passed 2 years ago, the teachers union, of course, came after it right away to try and kill it. They tried to collect signatures to refer the measure to the ballot where they might convince voters to repeal it. It was parents, already the existing stakeholders, many of them have children with special needs who are benefiting from the existing ESA program that was passed a decade earlier, were lining up at supermarkets to say, don't you dare sign that, my child is has been helped by this program, we need this. As a matter of public choice, having these programs be broad and universally available, I think helps their political viability, their sustainability, and really keeps them going.
And the school choice movement was blessed by having leaders at the state level come forward. When Speaker Toma, who's here, helped get that over the finish line with one vote margins in both House and Senate. It was a remarkable legislative accomplishment, and that was replicated in some other states as well, I take it.
Absolutely, and the lawmakers who championing these programs ultimately face the heat for doing it. It's their careers on the line, it's their reputation. They're at the tip of the spear for these programs, and I think what we've seen over the past few years is that they've tapped into something. They used to talk about silent majorities in American politics. The silent majority of American parents has been awakened from the pandemic, from what they're seeing happening in their schools, to long-term underperformance in our public schools. And I think they're drawing courage from representing those voices who are finally getting the freedom that they so deserve.
And let's return to Preston for a second. I neglected to ask you to describe for everyone here my favorite provision in the legislative version of your idea, the sidecar program, which you can describe.
Sure. So Mike and I have been up on the Hill promoting some model legislation that we have at FREOPP to try and address, this issue of the fact that the federal government is funding a lot of colleges and universities that simply don't produce any value for students. And so what we've come up with is we want to make the colleges and universities that are not producing value for students compensate taxpayers for federal student loans that their students are not able to repay. And so we estimate that this will bring in about $13 billion per year in just bad loans that are not going out or compensation that the universities are paying back to taxpayers. We take about half of that revenue and we put it into what I call the Pell Grant bonus. So right now, if you're a low-income student, you can get a Pell Grant in order to help fund your college education. What we do is we propose to increase that Pell Grant for low-income students, but only if they are enrolled in a program that leads to very high earnings outcomes for a very reasonable price. So if you're if you have a program that is charging students a very reasonable amount and catapulting them into jobs that pay a very decent salary, we propose that those low-income students in that program should be eligible for extra financial aid to help them afford tuition and to help the colleges be able to expand those programs that are really serving students well. And so we kind of use this carrot and stick approach. On one hand, saying to colleges, you have to make us whole if your students aren't paying back your loans. On the other hand, if you're serving your low-income students really well, we want to make sure they have a little bit of extra help so they can access that education. I think that carrot and stick put together can really transform the incentives that are facing colleges and universities today, and make sure that more low and middle-income students are able to access not education, but education that's actually going to lead to economic mobility.
Good. Thank you for that. I love that provision. I think that's very creative, and it's hard for anyone who has doubts about reforming higher education that they should be against your ideas. So thank you. I think we can turn to some questions now. And again, like everyone else, I have trouble seeing exactly who's out there with their hand up. So, right
Yes.
there. Yeah.
John Burlock.
Well, yeah, John, wait for the microphone, and then you can get.
Oh, my voice carries. Yes, John Burlock, Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thanks so much for the panel. Wondering if a change to the funding mechanism for federal student loans for a couple decades, from last decade and starting a couple decades ago, may have sort of changed the policy and the politics of this. It used to be, from my understanding, it's been a couple years since I've worked on this, that it was partially subsidized. The student loans went through like just regular banks and were subsidized. The banks were sort of subsidized by the federal government as well as the students. And that starting with the Clinton administration and then with Obama, in fact, I think something like a pay fair and Obamacare, as progressives are want to do, they say, well, why don't we just let the government run this itself, if the government runs things so efficiently? But I'm wondering I'm just wondering if there were any policy changes, good or bad in general, but I'm wondering if on the politics, if this may have been actually made this more, politically possible to get real, reforms in the program, since you no longer, really have the banks as lobbyists that much, and it's easier to attack for Republicans and conservative university presidents. And also, would the losses now be reported more to taxpayers more directly on the government's books, rather than sort of hidden, as part of with banks? So I'm just wondering if that development may have played a role in, sort of the new politics, and if there are any lessons we can learn from this.
That's a great question. So the way that the kind of federal student loan program used to work was, right now, the federal government makes loans directly to students through the colleges. It used to be the case that private banks would make the loans, but the federal government would guarantee those loans, and they would also set all the terms. So they'd set the loan limits, they set the interest rates, they'd decide which colleges are eligible for federal student loans and which are not. I think this system that we used to have was private in name only. So we had, so right now we don't have any kind of private involvement in the federal student loan program, but before, I'm not sure that the old guaranteed student loan program really did add that much value, because the value of having the private sector involved is if the private sector is exposed to losses on the student loans, they're going to take a hard look at each program they're funding and say, okay, we think this program is going to lead to good outcomes for students, we'll lend you some money for that, but we think this program over here is too expensive, the labor market outcomes are terrible, we're not going to lend money to that. So the private market can kind of impose some discipline on the colleges and universities in order to make sure that students are actually getting their return on investment. But under the old guaranteed student loan program, the federal government was still taking all the risk. So students defaulted on their loans, the federal government would, through guarantee agencies, basically make those private banks whole. And so I think the kind of the policy change we need to go back to is not necessarily the switch from guaranteed to direct lending. We need to go back to the creation of the federal student loan program itself back in 1965. That was really the inflection point when tuition started going up and up and up, because suddenly the federal government is pouring all this money into the program, into the sector, first through the banks, then directly to students. But what I will say is that the old guaranteed student loan program did make it somewhat more difficult for administrations who want to use the student loan program to essentially buy votes to do that through loan forgiveness, because if you're going through the banks, it's a lot more difficult to actually do that, to forgive the loans, because technically it's not the federal government that owns the loans. So I do think that switch over to direct lending did have an effect on the politics of all this, because suddenly the education department starts at least trying to forgive loans. Sometimes they're successful, sometimes the Supreme Court says no. That was not really an issue that we saw with the guaranteed student loan program.
Okay. Thank you. Question?
Thank you. Have you thought about what's the role of the states in these two, right? Obviously, the federal student loan program is a big part of the incentives issue, but a lot of states have free college programs for certain high school students, or free community college programs for all of the students. So what kind of reforms can we push in the states to make this more market-based and improve student outcomes?
I am so glad you asked that, because my colleague Annie Bowers, who's somewhere in here, and I just released a paper looking at 3 areas where states could focus higher education reform efforts in order to have a higher education create more economic value for students. And there are kind of 3 reform areas that we're pushing. So one is outcomes-based funding. So basically right now, the funding that state governments provide colleges and universities is usually just based on how many credit hours or how many students they're enrolling. We want to say, the schools should be funded, based on how well they're actually serving students. So have a funding formula that's based on graduates' earnings, job placement rates, and so forth. There's a community college in Texas called Texas State Technical College that has been funded this way for about 10 years now, and they've produced some excellent changes. When they moved over to this method of funding the college based on students' outcomes, what they decided to do was they're going to shut down all of these programs that are not leading to good earnings outcomes. They're going to start a bunch of new programs or expand enrollment in those programs. And what happened is that the starting wages for their graduates went up by 26% in just a few years, which is it's an amazing effect. You don't see effects like that very often. The second bucket that we're looking at is making it easier to start a new college or university if you have an innovative idea for how to deliver education. So the number of students at private nonprofit degree-granting colleges has gone up by 40% over the past 30 years. The number of new private nonprofit institutions has remained exactly flat. And that's because there are all these barriers to entry that state governments and the federal government to some extent set up. You have to get permission from the state government in order to operate. You have to have permission from an accreditor, and accreditation commissions are often comprised of the representatives of colleges and universities which exist right now. So you essentially have to ask your competitors for permission to start operating. If we were to remove some of those barriers to entry, allow new entrants into the market who have lower costs potentially, and more efficient methods of delivering instruction, are focusing in areas which are more labor market relevant, I think that could help students as well. And the final category of reforms we propose is making sure that you're not requiring degrees unnecessarily, both for jobs in your state executive branch, as a lot of governors have recently recognized, and in the private sector through the occupational licensing system. Like, a lot of states require a 4-year degree to be a home interior designer. A lot of states don't, and I'm not sure that degree requirement is really adding anything. So
That's right. Okay, another question. Here, one of our guests from Utah, state rep.
Thank you. I'm Candace Perucci in the Utah House. I have a question on housing. This is a massive issue. As a legislator, we always have one massive bill that comes through. It's the housing bill that is, 50 plus pages long. And my question has always been, if we keep dumping money into this, what is a developer's incentive to lower the cost if we're not ever asking, do the prices come down? I'm curious though, we've tried first-time home buyer loans, trying to increase access and prohibit cities from having onerous regulations by allowing accessory dwelling units, things like that. I'm curious what you'd recommend, because how do you, to your point, how do you create more housing to make it more affordable? Because it feels like all the levers we're pulling, it's not working, and someone is making a lot of cash off it.
Well, you've done some great things, and we've come up with do's and don'ts at the state level. No more money, because more money means inflation. The reason why housing is so expensive is because we keep putting more money into it. That's hard to understand. And the way that you solve that problem is you unleash the market and get rid of zoning altogether. Just get rid of it. Preempt local government from making any zoning laws at all. Building codes are good because they promote safety. You've got seismic requirements. But zoning is just, it's a 19th century, it's a 20th century solution to a 19th century problem, which was, the pig in the parlor. So if we could get states to begin to, take away that power from the local jurisdictions, and then condition subsidies on their complying with that requirement, and saying, oh, let the market provide the housing. Because right now, a homeless person in Salt Lake City has a cell phone. Why is that? Well, because we don't have a little junto that patrols and conditions and permits cell phone manufacturing. So if you can get those local governments out of the picture and let buyer and seller meet, prices will normalize and you won't have those fluctuations. It's very hard to produce housing. It's a very intensive capital, it takes time. And the problem is developers don't care once they get to a certain point. If there's enough demand, it rationalizes with the price. But don't make rules to make it harder for them by trying to exact cash from them, because they just pass that on to the consumer. So, you've got to, I think a fundamental rethinking of the state role, and it's hard because a lot of Republicans don't want to, this whole local control thing, but there does come a point where the role of the legislature is to come in and say, we need a rational statewide policy, and we need to make sure that local governments aren't doing things that are harmful to your constituents.
Okay, on that note, please join me in giving our guests, our panelists, a warm round of applause. And we have to get out of here.